Hi, I'm Selena, and today we are talking about the many-headed monster that is YA, specifically the evolution of said monster from the time where it was just a little bitty egg, and that's not what evolution is it? Moving swiftly along, we are going to talk about the evolution of the young adult genre, frequently abbreviated to YA. This video is going to be split into 4 parts. There will be timestamps in the description, so you can skip around, only watch the parts you want. I anticipate this being a long video, so you don't have to watch it all. The YA conversation sort of blew up again recently because of 2 separate incidents, one of them which happened on Twitter, where someone posted a picture that garnered a lot of anti-YA comments. I'm not going to go into that for this video because it's not relevant. If you would like to hear more about it though, check out the Book Leo's video, which I have linked in the comments. She explains what happened, what went down, why people got mad. And the other very separate thing that kind of reignited this conversation was 2 videos posted by the popular fantasy YouTuber Daniel Green. And he posted 2 videos, one of which talking about the history of YA fantasy, and the other video was about Daniel's personal problems with the YA genre and why it doesn't tend to be his favorite way to consume fantasy. In that video, he offers up some critiques for YA, which I will be responding to more directly in a very respectful manner in the next video. This video, though, is going to be a thorough but also pretty rough history of YA and how it developed from children's literature in the Anglophone tradition of literature. This is a conversation that is consistently evolving and changing and constantly happening in academic circles and non-academic circles, on BookTube, and basically anywhere where there's books. People are constantly talking about just this very thing, and people have different arguments about it. This is more just my argument, if you will, about what I think the evolution of YA looked like. There's also several other videos on the topic that I will link down below, and I will link all my research for this in a Google Doc. On to part 1. How do we define YA? I am inclined to agree with Daniel on this for at least the modern YA state of things. YA is a marketing genre. It markets primarily to people between the ages of 12 and 18. And this will come up later, but middle grade markets to 8 to 12-year-olds. And so YA picks up right where middle grade ends. But YA is a fairly new age category. You'll see older readers telling you that they didn't have YA when they were growing up, and they went straight from reading children's literature to adults literature. How did we get here with a whole section of the bookstore being reserved for YA and a whole group of people in and out of the target audience who love YA? In other words, we're going to be looking at how YA blew up. Moving swiftly along, in order to talk about the evolution of YA, we first have to talk about the evolution of children's literature. I do have to warn you that I'm going to go through like 200 years or something of books. They're not a very diverse list because I grew up reading books within the Anglophone tradition, the really hyped books written by English-speaking authors who are also generally white. And so that means that my perspective is very limited, and I am fully open to more people bringing up books that I forgot or didn't know about and recommending them down in the comments. Early realist stories published and targeted towards children in Georgian Great Britain were largely didactic. They were meant to show children possible choices they may encounter in their lives and steer them towards the morally correct choice. The Rosamund stories are an example of this type of didactic story that was published during the late 18th century, early 19th century. They follow a girl named Rosamund who encounters these moral dilemmas and tries to figure them out. There's one called The Purple Jar, where she, without the guidance of her mother, chooses a pretty yet useless thing to buy instead of spending her money on the new shoes that she would need. This story in particular really emphasizes a tough love sort of mentality, and Rosamund has to deal with the consequences of her choice. But if you think of it in terms of fiction, this was geared towards children so that if they encountered this moral dilemma, they would make the choice that Rosamund didn't, and they wouldn't face these consequences in real life. Fairy tales are also quite popular during this time, but I'm not really going to touch too much on fairy tales because it's really up in the air and an ongoing discussion whether fairy tales were really meant for children or not. The consensus that I have made in myself is that children heard them. Some were aimed towards children even if they were dark. Some were not aimed towards children. But the later a fairy tale collection or a myth collection or a legend was published, the more likely chance it is that it was aimed towards children. The beginning of the Victorian era converged closely with the coming of Charles Dickens onto the scene when Dickens published his first serialized piece called The Pickwick Papers in 1936. In Dickens, we encounter a man who frequently wrote about coming-of-age stories and included children in his works. He brought attention to a lot of issues that children were facing in Victorian London, such as the plight of orphans who were forced to work in really terrible conditions. A lot of his stories did star children for at least part of the book, but they weren't necessarily aimed towards children. Some examples of this are Oliver Twist, Great Expectations, and David Copperfield. Dickens does a lot of work to help adults sympathize with children in terrible situations such as orphans, and this is where we really see the coming-of-age story come to fruition and the orphan trope really take off. So you can thank Dickens next time you read a coming-of-age story starring an orphan. Around this time, we also start to see a change in how people think of children, which of course affects the literature they give to them. Before this time, people saw children as mini adults that would grow up and become big adults. Now we start to see a shift in thinking to seeing children as innocent beings who need to be protected. I will admit that this is not my strongest area, and I'm sure there's many debates about this, so if someone wants to correct me in the comments or tell me it's more nuanced than that or something, go right ahead. Then, in 1865, my favorite satire about how children were treated was published, and that book is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. So, avoiding speculation about Lewis Carroll's personal life or his relationship with children, because I really do not want to touch that can of worms, Alice parodied the way that children were treated in Victorian society. For example, in Victorian England, children were expected to memorize poems and be able to recite them at the drop of a hat to any adult that wanted to hear this kid recite this poem. They could say, recite this, and the kid would have to do it. Carol not only includes a scene where the caterpillar asks Alice to recite poetry, but Lewis Carroll also parodies the popular poems that these kids were expected to recite, and he makes them funny, and these are originally very moralistic poems, and he makes them funny and nonsensical. In the caterpillar scene, the caterpillar says, "Repeat, 'You are old, Father William,' to Alice," and Alice tries to recite "You are old, Father William." The original poem, written by Robert Southey, looks like this. Carol's version looks like this. I'm going to recite 2 stanzas of each so that those who are watching who may be without sight can hear, and mark the differences as we go along. Southey's poem. "You are old, Father William," the young man cried. "The few locks that are left you are gray. You are hale, Father William, a hearty old man. Now tell me the reason, I pray." "In the days of my youth," Father William replied, "I remembered that youth would fly fast, and abused not my health and my vigor at first, that I never might need them at last." Versus Carol's version. "You are old, Father William," the young man said, "and your hair has become very white, and yet you incessantly stand on your head. Do you think at your age it is right?" "In my youth," Father William replied to his son, "I feared it might injure the brain, but now that I'm perfectly sure I have none, why, I do it again and again." From those stanzas, you can get a sense of how Carol is changing with Alice the way that adults are supposed to act with children. Carol with Alice also gave children's literature something it had not seen before. nonsense and whimsy and fantasy. We'd seen ghost stories like A Christmas Carol, and we'd seen didactic stories like the Rosamond stories, but no one else created a Wonderland, from what I could find. Wonderland was something special. Wonderland was something different that Lewis Carroll gave to kids. It has illustrations in it. It is full of nonsense, and it is really not trying to shove any morals down your throat. It is really more about loving childhood while you have it. And in my opinion, this book really changed the game for children's literature, and if it hadn't been published, everything would be different. After that, we see an absolute explosion of children's literature, and a lot of it has magical elements, and a lot of it doesn't. In the Americas, we see the likes of Little Women, Anne of Green Gables, and the works of Mark Twain. As far as American fantastical stories go, well, we're not in Kansas anymore. In Britain, we see the Winnie the Pooh stories and the Mary Poppins series take off. We also have the works of Frances Hodgson Burnett, who wrote in both Britain and America, and whose story Little Lord Fauntleroy far overshadowed her more popular works today. When the 1930s roll around, we really see the formation of genre fiction. In 1937, we see J.R.R. Tolkien publish The Hobbit, which he meant as a fairy story that parents could read to their children at night before bed. Editing Selena here, I wanted to just correct something I said in the video. So what I said in the video was that in 1937, Tolkien published The Hobbit as like a story that parents could read to their kids before bed. And that is something you could do with The Hobbit, but I should not have made that sound so much like that was the only thing that Tolkien intended for The Hobbit, because that is not it. Tolkien did not really see stories as children's stories or adult stories. So here is when we start to see a bit of a blurring of those lines between adult stories and children's stories through Tolkien, because he did not believe in such distinctions. In 1950, C.S. Lewis published The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and this further solidified fantasy's place in children's literature, but at the time it wasn't really meant for just children, and C.S. Lewis basically admitted that he didn't mean it only for children in this book. He dedicated Lion to his goddaughter Lucy and wrote this note to her in the book: "My dear Lucy, I wrote this story for you, but when I began it, I had not realized that girls grow quicker than books. As a result, you are already too old for fairy tales, and by the time it is printed and bound, you will be older still. But someday, you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. You can take it down from some upper shelf, dust it, and tell me what you think of it. I shall probably be too deaf to hear and too old to understand a word you say, but I shall still be your affectionate godfather, C.S. Lewis." As well as being extremely sweet, that dedication tells us something about C.S. Lewis's audience, or at least the audience he thought would pick up his books. He expected the very young or the reasonably old to pick up this book and love it, but there's this middle age that coincides pretty well with young adulthood that he didn't think would have any time for his story. Ursula K. Le Guin would come along in 1968 with A Wizard of Earthsea to fill that void. Le Guin has said that Earthsea probably would have been published as YA if it had been a marketing genre at the time, but it wasn't, so it wasn't. Editing Selena here again, because I did say another thing wrong, because apparently I can't speak. Le Guin has admitted that she was asked to write a young adult novel, and this is what she came up with. And so this is technically one of the first in the fantasy genre to be targeted at young adults by marketing. It seems to me, though, with the formation of genre fiction with the authors like Tolkien and Lewis and Le Guin and L'Engle, we start seeing older protagonists come onto the scene. According to the article, The Outsiders was groundbreaking, but it didn't create YA fiction. A lot of these stories were not necessarily intended for children, but were co-opted by them anyways. From what I have found, Le Guin seems to be the most intentional with her aiming towards young adults, or that teen age with her books. But this conversation brings us to the state of YA. We've seen fantasy published for kids of all ages, and we see the 1951 realistic fiction book Catcher in the Rye hit shelves and make waves. These books are not marketed as YA, but they appeal to the YA audience at the time anyways. Why? Well, according to PBS Digital Studios, I will link their video down in the description, a team of librarians at the New York Public Libraries curated their own list of books that were targeted towards adults and children, but they thought young adults would like. And so this really is the first time we see a young adult category emerge somewhere, and it wasn't even with publishers, it was with librarians. However, that was in 1906, and since all the books I'm speaking about right now were published 50 years after the fact, I'm not saying that they specifically did it, but I am just saying that there was a precedent for books like this to be targeted towards young adults in at least libraries. And since books kept being published that fit this age group, like Le Guin's Earthsea, it makes you wonder, was this when YA emerged? Not as a marketing genre, but as a category of books that had nothing to do with marketing. But back to one such YA type book that wasn't really meant for teens specifically, Catcher in the Rye. Catcher in the Rye was revolutionary because it asserted that teen stories are important. Even if those kids go down rough paths, do stupid things, and lose their way. And speaking of books with teens that go down rough paths, do stupid things, and lose their way, you know I had to do it to them. The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. This was a book by a teen that was published in 1967 that didn't hit big with the adult readers, but YA readers, young adult age readers, flocked towards this book, and the sales for it were primarily by teens. While it may not have been the first book discussing teens dealing with a tumultuous time with a lot of external struggles to overcome, it was one of the first that made publishers kind of sit up and take a listen and be like, maybe there's a market here. In 1970, we see the publication of Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret by Judy Blume, which talked about more taboo topics such as religion and going through puberty as a girl. Then YA has like a long phase of like serialization with books like The Goosebumps in the 80s and 90s until we get to one book that changed the face of YA forever. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, or Philosopher's Stone. This series, which started being published in 1997, was a phenomenon. And like Daniel Green pointed out, it grew with its audience. And I argue that the YA genre has mirrored these 7 books by growing with its audience. But more on that later. And as Harry Potter is being published, we see YA develop even more in the genres of hard-hitting contemporaries with the 1999 release Speak, and a bit later, Looking for Alaska by John Green in 2005. We also see a wave of fantasy stories targeted towards younger audiences, such as Aragon published in 2002, Inkheart published in 2003, The Ruins of Gorlan published in 2004, and The Lightning Thief published in 2005. And you can tell by reading these books that YA largely steered away from dark content and themes. Nowadays, they read more like middle grade. And we sometimes call them middle grade, but they weren't technically published as that. I believe they were still children's literature. In 2005, though, we see an older, more mature type of YA kick off. Paranormal romance, kicked off by Twilight by Stephenie Meyer. And say what you want about Twilight, but this franchise blew up and was huge and got a lot of people into YA. And honestly became the face of YA for a little bit there. After this, YA begins maturing and it incorporates romance more into its main plots. Even with this maturing though, no one was prepared for the Hunger Games. In 2008, this dystopian featuring a bloody game where teens killed each other and fought to the death while the whole world watched and the whole world read about it, the level of darkness expected in YA changed. We'd seen books with similar themes that teens had flocked towards, but not really any marketed as YA. This, I think, is still one of the darkest YA books we have, and there's few things that have really surpassed this limit. As we've seen, YA and what is popular in YA moves in waves, but one genre seems to have been pretty strong from the start, and it's still going strong, and that is the hard-hitting contemporary. In 2012, we saw The Fault in Our Stars by John Green completely take off and be a huge success in and out of the YA audience, get movie deals, everyone was obsessed with it, everyone was crying about it, everyone loved it. I argue that this hard-hitting contemporary has evolved, and now we're seeing an inclusion of more topics contemporaries, where contemporaries discuss really relevant topics like race. One great example of that is The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas. This is only the dust jacket because my aunt has it. The Hate U Give was kind of a phenomenon also. It also transcended the YA audience and into adults. I saw adults reading this at the pool. And that's because it talks about really relevant topics to our society at the moment. And so YA contemporary has always been able to find relevancy and maintain its place, even when other trends do die out. However, there's a lesser talked about trend in YA, and that is why we're going to spend a whole part talking about it. It's not going to be that long, but we are going to talk about it a little bit, and that is the evolution of YA fantasy. Because I argue that just like we had a paranormal phase kicked off by Twilight and a dystopian phase kicked off by The Hunger Games, we now have a fantasy phase. And specifically more high, intricate fantasy in YA. And if I had to tell you who kicked that off, I would say it's Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo and Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. This is where the video transitions into part 3, the evolution of YA fantasy. I'm going to focus on Shadow and Bone for this section because I've not read Throne of Glass, but I do know that Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo combined a lot of the things that have been successful in YA so far and put them in a fantasy setting. So coming of age stories, the growing darkness and themes of morality in YA. Oh, and of course, romance at the center stage. And that's part of why it was so successful. And it may seem old or like not as relevant now because we see this all the time. This was pretty new. I mean, it took a lot of old things and combined them, but this is the first time that I saw this done to this extent, and after this, a lot of books begin looking like this book and Throne of Glass. Along with topic contemporary books, I would say the ever-changing tide of YA is with YA fantasy right now, specifically those modeled after Grisha and Throne of Glass. These are books like The Crown's Game and Children of Blood and Bone. Along with that, though, YA fantasy hasn't stayed at this level. We've been progressively seeing YA get darker and darker and have more violent or sexual content, and that's how we get into YA crossover books. I don't want to spend too much time on YA crossover books because there's plenty of great videos about it. Alexa Dunn has one and I'll link her. She can talk about it in much more depth than I can, but basically what a YA crossover book is a book that is generally written by an author who has had success in the YA genre but wants to explore darker or more sexual content, and that's how we end up getting books like A Court of Thorns and Roses with full-on sex scenes and Six of Crows with darker content than YA has necessarily seen, arguably. These crossover books are quite popular, especially because a lot of the YA audience is made up of adults. And that's fine. Adults can read YA, of course. I read YA. I'm 20 years old. I'm fully a fan of adults reading YA. It's just that YA books are starting to be marketed like this. Crossover books are being marketed as YA, even though you can argue that they don't belong in the YA section. This is the YA that we are really seeing dominate YA right now, and it's kind of pushed lower YA out of the market. When's the last time an Aragon was published in the YA genre? It wasn't. It was published as middle grade. And here is when we bring it back to middle grade. The darkening of YA that has been going on since 2008 has necessarily created a bridge genre kind of called middle grade, which takes all of the lower YA books or the younger sort of books with lighter content and kind of absorbs them into its group. So that's why we see things like Aragon or The Goose Girl that were technically published as like a broad children's, like young people sort of book. Those writing styles and themes fit more with middle grade now, although they don't entirely read exactly like middle grade, but they weren't published as middle grade because YA has changed. In my opinion, middle grade has also gotten younger than those YA books. If you look at Rick Riordan's books, I feel like Percy Jackson had a lot more complexity and just moral grayness and things to it. And his newer stuff reads a bit more simple to me. It's not a bad thing necessarily, but I definitely think that Percy Jackson series was marketed towards younger kids and also like a bit older, young YA readers. While I think his new stuff like Magnus Chase is definitely that middle grade type of book. A thing that I want to touch on here that people haven't really talked about is that these age categories, if we look at the kids actually reading these books, it depends on the kid, of course, but kids are ready for YA really early now. When I was recommending books that I loved as a middle schooler to my boyfriend's little sister when she was 12, I was saying books that I liked when I was 12, but she was way more interested in books like Red Queen, who are like YA, like straight up YA books, younger YA books, but YA books. And so kids who technically are in the middle grade age are ready for young adult, but they may not fully be ready for something like ACOTAR. And so there is a need for YA to cater to those kids too, and that's created a lot of the tonal differences in YA that we've seen. And the problem with YA crossover dominating the genre is that it could be leaving a lot of its younger audience behind, and it's young adults, so it can't really do that, can it? More on that in my next video, which is going to be part 2 to this, and that's going to be called The Criticisms of YA, where I respond more directly to Daniel Green's criticisms of YA in his second video. I hope you stick around. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm Selena, and I'll see you next time. Bye.